Welcome to History with Herodotus, where we delve into the most fascinating tales of the past. Today, we embark on an extraordinary journey through one of the most pivotal moments in modern history, the American Revolution. As we explore this transformative era, you'll witness the birth of a nation forged in the fires of rebellion and shaped by the unyielding spirit of its people. As the French and Indian War drew to a close in 1763, the British Empire found itself burdened with an immense debt, estimated at around $122 million. This staggering sum was accumulated from the costly campaigns against the French and their Native American allies, which had lasted for 7 long years. The war had been fought on multiple fronts, from the frozen wilderness of Canada to the sweltering jungles of the Caribbean, and had drained the British treasury. To alleviate this financial strain, the British government turned its attention to the colonies, seeking to exploit their economic potential. The Proclamation of 1763, issued by King George III, aimed to prevent colonial expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains, thereby preserving Native American lands and reducing the costs associated with governing the vast territories. However, the British soon realized that more drastic measures were needed to replenish their coffers. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act, which imposed a tax on sugar, wine, and other goods imported into the colonies. This marked the beginning of a new era in colonial taxation, as the British sought to exert greater control over their American subjects. The following year, the Stamp Act was enacted, requiring colonists to purchase stamps for various printed materials, such as newspapers, legal documents, and even playing cards. The outrage sparked by these taxes was palpable, with many colonists arguing that they had no say in the matter as they were not represented in Parliament. The cry of "no taxation without representation" echoed through the streets, from the bustling ports of Boston to the rural towns of Virginia. As tensions escalated, colonial resistance organizations began to emerge. The Sons of Liberty, a radical group led by patriots like Samuel Adams and James Otis, organized protests and boycotts against British goods. In Boston, the Massachusetts Stamp Act Congress convened, with representatives from 9 colonies attending, to coordinate a unified response to the British taxes. The colonists' determination to resist the imposition of taxes by a distant and unresponsive government was fueled by their sense of identity and community. They saw themselves as British subjects, entitled to the same rights and freedoms as their counterparts in England. However, the British government's actions seemed to undermine this sense of belonging, treating them instead as mere subjects, devoid of any meaningful say in their own governance. In 1767, Charles Townshend, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, introduced a new set of taxes known as the Townshend Acts. These duties targeted goods such as glass, paint, and paper, and were designed to raise revenue for the British government. The colonists, however, saw this as another attempt to strangle their economy and undermine their rights. In response, they organized boycotts of British goods, with merchants and traders refusing to import or sell the taxed items. The impact was significant, with British exports to the colonies declining by over 50% between 1768 and 1769. The boycotts also had a profound effect on the colonists themselves, fostering a sense of solidarity and shared purpose. As the boycotts took hold, tensions between the colonists and British authorities continued to rise. In Boston, the presence of British soldiers who had been stationed in the city since 1768 became a source of growing resentment. The atmosphere was volatile, with skirmishes and scuffles breaking out between the soldiers and the local population. On March 5, 1770, this simmering tension boiled over into violence as a group of British soldiers fired into a crowd of protesters, killing 5 people. The Boston Massacre, as it came to be known, was a pivotal moment in the lead-up to the American Revolution, shifting public sentiment decisively against the British. The massacre was seized upon by patriots like Paul Revere, who created a famous engraving of the event depicting the British soldiers as ruthless and brutal. The image was widely circulated, helping to galvanize opposition to British rule and fueled a growing sense of outrage among the colonists. As the news of the massacre spread, it became clear that the relationship between the colonies and Great Britain had reached a breaking point. The aftermath of the Boston Massacre saw a significant escalation in tensions between the colonies and Great Britain. The British government, under the leadership of Lord North, responded to the growing unrest with a series of coercive measures designed to quell the rebellion and restore order. However, these actions only served to further alienate the colonists, who saw them as an attempt to undermine their rights and freedoms. As the situation continued to deteriorate, it became increasingly clear that the American Revolution was not just a struggle for independence, but also a clash of ideologies. With the colonists fighting for their right to self-governance and the British seeking to maintain their authority over the colonies. In the years leading up to the outbreak of war, the colonists began to organize themselves into a cohesive force with the creation of the Continental Congress and the establishment of a unified military command. The British, on the other hand, struggled to respond effectively to the growing rebellion, hampered by their own internal divisions and the vast distances between the colonies and Great Britain. As the two sides moved inexorably towards conflict, it became clear that the American Revolution would be a war like no other, fought not just for territory or resources, but for the very principles of liberty and democracy themselves. To coordinate their efforts and present a united front against the British, they established Committees of Correspondence, which facilitated communication and cooperation among the various colonies. These committees, comprising prominent patriots like Samuel Adams, John Adams, and Patrick Henry, played a crucial role in fostering colonial unity and laying the groundwork for a coordinated resistance movement. For instance, the Massachusetts Committee of Correspondence, formed in 1772, worked tirelessly to disseminate information about British atrocities and rally support from other colonies, ultimately helping to create a sense of shared purpose and solidarity among the colonists. As the Committees of Correspondence sprang into action, they began to weave a complex web of alliances and relationships that would eventually bind the colonies together in their quest for independence. The committees facilitated the exchange of ideas, news, and strategies, allowing the colonists to present a unified front against the British. They also helped to identify and cultivate key leaders such as George Washington, who would play a pivotal role in the coming war. For example, the Virginia Committee of Correspondence, established in 1773, worked closely with other colonies to coordinate their response to British provocations, demonstrating the growing sense of intercolonial cooperation and solidarity. The Committees of Correspondence proved instrumental in mobilizing opposition to the Tea Act, passed by Parliament in 1773. This legislation granted the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, effectively bypassing local merchants and middlemen. The colonists, already wary of British taxation policies, saw this as yet another attempt to strangle their economy and undermine their rights. In response, they organized protests and boycotts, culminating in the infamous Boston Tea Party. On December 16, 1773, a group of patriots, disguised as Native Americans, boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and tossed hundreds of chests of tea into the water, sending a powerful message to the British government that the colonists would no longer be dictated to. The night of the Boston Tea Party was a moment of high drama, with the sound of shattering porcelain and the smell of salt water filling the air as the patriots made their bold statement. The event was a watershed moment in American history, marking a point of no return in the colonists' struggle for independence. As news of the Tea Party spread throughout the colonies, it galvanized support for the patriot cause, with many seeing it as a heroic act of defiance against British tyranny. The British, however, were not about to let this affront go unpunished. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of laws known as the Intolerable Acts, designed to punish the colonists for their defiance and reassert British authority. These acts included the Boston Port Act, which closed the port of Boston until the tea was paid for, the Massachusetts Government Act, which effectively abolished the colonial government, and the Quartering Act, which allowed British soldiers to be billeted in the homes of colonists. The Intolerable Acts had the opposite effect of their intended purpose, as they galvanized opposition to British rule and pushed the colonies closer to open rebellion. For example, the closure of Boston Harbor led to widespread economic hardship, but it also prompted other colonies to come to the aid of Massachusetts, fostering a sense of intercolonial solidarity and cooperation. The people of Philadelphia, New York, and other cities rallied around their fellow colonists in Boston, sending food, supplies, and messages of support. This outpouring of sympathy and assistance helped to create a sense of shared purpose and collective identity among the colonies, laying the groundwork for a unified resistance movement. In response to the intolerable acts, the colonists convened the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, which brought together representatives from 12 colonies. This gathering marked a significant milestone in the development of colonial unity, as it provided a platform for coordinated action and collective decision-making. The Continental Congress issued a statement of grievances, known as the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, and established the Continental Association, a boycott of British goods aimed at pressuring Parliament to repeal the intolerable acts. The Continental Association, which included provisions for the non-importation, non-consumption, and non-exportation of British goods, was a bold statement of colonial resolve and marked a significant escalation in the conflict between the colonies and Great Britain. As the delegates gathered in Philadelphia's Carpenter's Hall, they were acutely aware of the gravity of their situation and the risks they were taking by challenging British authority. Yet, they were also driven by a deep sense of conviction and a determination to defend their rights as Englishmen. On April 18, 1775, Gage ordered a contingent of approximately 700 British soldiers to march on Lexington and Concord, with the goal of seizing these stores and crushing the rebellion before it could gain further momentum. The decision was made in the dead of night, under the faint glow of candlelight, as Gage pored over maps and strategized with his officers. However, Paul Revere and William Dawes, two American patriots, had been warned of the impending raid by a network of informants and spies. They quickly set out to alert the militia, riding through the night on horseback, the sound of hooves echoing through the stillness. As they rode, the darkness seemed to vibrate with an air of urgency, as if the very fate of the colonies depended on their mission. The Old North Bridge in Lexington loomed ahead, its wooden slats creaking in the gentle breeze like a sentinel guarding the approach to the town. As the British approached the bridge, they encountered a group of about 70 militiamen who were ordered to disperse by Major Pitcairn. But the colonists, fueled by a deep sense of conviction and a determination to defend their rights as Englishmen, stood their ground. The air was thick with tension, heavy with the weight of uncertainty, as the two sides faced off against each other. A shot was fired, later to be known as the "shot heard round the world," marking the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. The sound of the musket echoed through the morning air, a clarion call to arms that would be remembered for generations to come. The British troops continued on to Concord, where they encountered more resistance from the militia, who had been mobilized by the alarm riders. The colonists employed guerrilla tactics, attacking the British from behind trees and rocks, using the familiar terrain to their advantage. The sound of musketry and cannon fire filled the air, as the two sides clashed in a series of skirmishes that would become known as the Battles of Lexington and Concord. The British, weighed down by their heavy packs and cumbersome formations, struggled to respond effectively to the colonists' hit-and-run tactics. As the British retreated back to Boston, they were harried by the militiamen, who inflicted significant casualties on the redcoats. The road back to the city was a gauntlet of ambushes and sniping, as the colonists took advantage of every opportunity to strike at their enemy. This series of skirmishes marked a decisive turning point in the conflict, as it galvanized support for the Patriot cause and demonstrated that the colonists would not be easily intimidated. The news of the British defeat spread like wildfire, igniting a flame of resistance that would burn brightly across the colonies. The British Army, now besieged in Boston by the militia, found itself in a precarious position. The city, once a hub of commerce and culture, was now a prison, with the British trapped inside and the colonists holding the keys. The Second Continental Congress, which convened on May 10, 1775, recognized the need for a unified military effort and began to take steps towards creating a Continental Army. On June 15, 1775, the Congress appointed George Washington, a veteran of the French and Indian War, as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Washington's first task was to assume command of the siege of Boston, where he worked tirelessly to organize and train the militia into a more cohesive fighting force. As the summer wore on, the British, still holed up in Boston, attempted to break out of the city by capturing the high ground on Charlestown Peninsula, which offered a commanding view of the harbor. On June 17, 1775, the British launched a frontal assault on Breed's Hill, where the colonists had erected a series of earthen redoubts. The Battle of Bunker Hill, as it came to be known, was one of the bloodiest engagements of the war, with over 1,000 British casualties and nearly 500 American dead or wounded. Although the British technically won the battle, they suffered devastating losses and realized that the war would not be easily won. Meanwhile, in the American colonies, the momentum was building towards a formal declaration of independence. The Continental Congress, fueled by the passion and conviction of its delegates, was now more determined than ever to break free from British rule. It was in this context that Thomas Paine's influential pamphlet, Common Sense, was published in January 1776, arguing passionately for American independence from Britain. Paine's powerful rhetoric and straightforward language helped to galvanize public opinion, making a compelling case for why the colonies should break free from British rule. His pamphlet sold over 500,000 copies, an astonishing number considering the population of the colonies at the time, and it played a significant role in shaping the debate over independence. As Paine's words spread like wildfire through the colonies, they struck a chord with many who had grown tired of British tyranny. His pamphlet was read aloud in taverns and town squares, its words igniting heated debates and passionate discussions about the future of the colonies. The air was electric with anticipation, as if the very fate of the nation hung in the balance. As the debate over breaking from Britain intensified, the Continental Congress found itself divided on the issue. Some delegates, such as John Dickinson, still hoped for reconciliation with Britain, while others, like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, were convinced that independence was the only viable option. The Congress convened a committee to draft a formal Declaration of Independence, with Thomas Jefferson tasked with writing the initial draft. Jefferson's draft, which would eventually become the Declaration of Independence, was rooted in the philosophical underpinnings of the Enlightenment, drawing heavily from the ideas of John Locke and other influential thinkers. Jefferson's document was more than just a statement of grievances against the British Crown. It was a profound exploration of the human condition. He poured his heart and soul into the draft, drawing upon his vast knowledge of history, philosophy, and literature to craft a document that would inspire generations to come. The famous opening sentence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," reflected the colonists' deep-seated commitment to the principles of liberty and equality. However, the drafting process was not without its challenges and compromises. Jefferson's original draft included a scathing denunciation of the slave trade, which was ultimately deleted at the insistence of Southern delegates who feared it would alienate slaveholding colonies from the cause of independence. This compromise reflected the complex and often contradictory nature of the American Revolution, which sought to promote liberty and equality while also tolerating the institution of slavery. The tension between these competing ideals was palpable as delegates grappled with the moral implications of their actions. Despite these challenges, the Declaration of Independence remained a powerful statement of the colonists' aspirations for freedom and self-governance, and it would go on to become one of the most influential documents in American history. As the Continental Congress debated and refined the document, the British government continued to view the rebellion as a threat to its authority. King George III and his ministers remained determined to crush the rebellion, and they began to assemble a large army to be sent to the colonies. With the Declaration of Independence nearing completion, the Continental Congress was poised to take a momentous step, one that would formally announce the birth of a new nation and set in motion a chain of events that would shape the course of modern history. The fate of the colonies hung precariously in the balance, as if the very fabric of destiny was about to be torn apart by the forces of revolution and counter-revolution. The British Army, led by General William Howe and his brother Admiral Richard Howe, had assembled a fleet of over 400 ships and 32,000 troops. intent on capturing the strategic port city and splitting the colonies. The sheer scale of their armada was awe-inspiring, with towering warships and sleek frigates that seemed to glide effortlessly across the waters of New York Harbor. Washington's Continental Army, numbering around 19,000 men, was vastly outnumbered and outgunned, its troops a patchwork of inexperienced militiamen, rugged frontiersmen, and seasoned veterans. Despite being outnumbered, Washington's forces put up a valiant defense, but they were ultimately forced to retreat from New York City in August 1776. The British Army pursued, and Washington's troops suffered a series of defeats on Long Island and in Manhattan, including the Battle of Brooklyn Heights and the Battle of Kip's Bay. As the autumn of 1776 wore on, Washington's army was in full retreat, fleeing across New Jersey with the British hot on their heels. The landscape itself seemed to conspire against them, with rolling hills, dense forests, and treacherous ravines that slowed their progress and funneled them into killing zones. In a bold and daring move, Washington decided to launch a surprise counterattack against the Hessian forces stationed in Trenton, New Jersey. On Christmas Day, 1776, Washington's troops crossed the icy Delaware River under the cover of night, braving treacherous conditions and enemy patrols. The air was crisp and cold, the stars twinkling like diamonds above as they pushed off from the riverbank and began their perilous journey. The next morning, they launched a surprise attack on the Hessian garrison in Trenton, catching them off guard and scoring a decisive victory. This triumph was followed by another at Princeton, New Jersey, where Washington's forces defeated a British army led by General Charles Cornwallis. These victories at Trenton and Princeton marked a turning point in the war, as they boosted American morale and demonstrated that the Continental Army could stand toe-to-toe with the British. The news of their successes spread like wildfire, inspiring countless Americans to take up arms and join the fight for independence. Meanwhile, in upstate New York, another pivotal campaign was unfolding. In September 1777, a large British army led by General John Burgoyne marched south from Canada, intent on splitting the colonies and forcing a negotiated settlement. However, they were met by a determined American force led by General Horatio Gates, who had assembled a diverse army of militiamen, frontiersmen, and regular troops. The two armies clashed in September and October 1777 at the Battle of Saratoga, which proved to be a decisive American victory. Burgoyne's army was trapped and forced to surrender, marking a major turning point in the war. The Saratoga campaign convinced France to ally itself with the Americans, providing significant financial and military aid that would help shift the balance of power in their favor. The French saw an opportunity to weaken their ancient enemy, Britain, and gain a strategic foothold in North America, and they were willing to invest heavily in the American cause. As the winter of 1777-78 set in, Washington's Continental Army encamped at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, where they would endure one of the most brutal winters of the war. The camp was a sprawling, makeshift city of tents and wooden huts, with smoke drifting lazily from thousands of fires as the troops huddled for warmth. Despite the harsh conditions, Washington used this period to professionalize his army with the help of Prussian military officer Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. Von Steuben drilled the troops relentlessly, teaching them European-style tactics and discipline that would serve them well in future battles. Under von Steuben's tutelage, the Continental Army transformed into a cohesive and formidable fighting force, capable of standing up to the British Army in pitched battles. The winter at Valley Forge was a crucible, testing the mettle of Washington's troops and forging them into a unified and determined force. As the snow began to thaw in the spring of 1778, the Continental Army emerged from Valley Forge as a rejuvenated and revitalized force, ready to take on the British and their allies in the battles that lay ahead. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous, with troops who had once been ragtag and undisciplined now marching in lockstep, their muskets at the ready and their hearts full of hope and determination. The French alliance, formalized in February 1778, proved to be a game-changer for the American cause. France's entry into the war marked a significant shift in the international dimensions of the conflict, as the British now faced a powerful enemy on multiple fronts. The French provided substantial financial and military aid to the Americans, including troops, ships, and equipment. One notable example of French support was the arrival of the Comte de Rochambeau's army in July 1780, which bolstered Washington's forces and helped to shift the balance of power in their favor. The French army brought with them not only military might, but also a sense of culture and sophistication as they introduced the Americans to the finer things in life, from cuisine to fashion. As the war expanded beyond North America, Spain and the Netherlands also entered the conflict, further complicating the international landscape. Spain, seeking to regain territories lost to Britain during the 7 Years' War, declared war on Britain in June 1779. The Spanish focused their efforts on the Gulf Coast and the Mississippi River Valley, capturing key British outposts and disrupting their supply lines. Meanwhile, the Netherlands, which had long been a major trading partner with the Americans, declared war on Britain in December 1780. The Dutch provided significant financial and naval support to the Americans, helping to weaken the British economy and disrupt their maritime trade. The entry of these new belligerents marked a turning point in the war, as the British found themselves facing a coalition of powerful enemies on multiple fronts. Naval warfare played an increasingly important role during this period, as the French and American fleets clashed with the British Navy in a series of battles. Privateering, or piracy sanctioned by the state, also became a major factor as American and French privateers targeted British merchant ships and disrupted their supply lines. One notable example was the exploits of John Paul Jones, an American naval officer who commanded the USS Bonhomme Richard and scored several victories against British warships. In September 1779, Jones engaged the HMS Serapis in a fierce battle off the coast of England, ultimately emerging victorious despite being outgunned. The bravery and cunning of Jones and his crew inspired the American people and struck fear into the hearts of their enemies. The war's economic impact was felt deeply on both sides, as the conflict disrupted trade and led to widespread inflation and debt. The Continental Congress struggled to finance the war effort, relying on loans from France and other European nations to keep the army supplied and equipped. The British, meanwhile, faced significant economic strain as they attempted to maintain a large military presence in North America, while also fighting wars against France, Spain, and the Netherlands. The British government was forced to impose heavy taxes on its citizens, leading to widespread discontent and opposition to the war. As the war dragged on, the economic burden began to take its toll on both sides, with inflation and debt becoming major concerns. In 1779, the Continental Congress issued a new currency known as Continentals, which quickly depreciated in value due to inflation and lack of confidence. The British, meanwhile, faced a severe credit crisis in 1780, as their government struggled to pay its debts and maintain a stable economy. The financial strain ultimately contributed to the British decision to shift their strategy and focus on a southern campaign, hoping to split the colonies and negotiate a peace settlement. However, this plan would ultimately prove unsuccessful as the Americans continued to resist and the French and Spanish maintained their support for the rebellion. As the war entered its final stages, the psychological toll on both sides began to show. The British, who had once been confident of a quick victory, now faced the prospect of a long and bloody conflict with no end in sight. The Americans, meanwhile, were buoyed by their successes and increasingly confident of their ability to win independence. The French and Spanish, who had entered the war with their own interests in mind, now found themselves deeply committed to the American cause, and their continued support would ultimately prove decisive. The winter of 1779-80 was particularly harsh, with freezing temperatures and heavy snowfalls crippling both armies. Morale began to sag, and desertions became increasingly common. However, Washington's leadership and the resilience of his troops kept the Continental Army intact despite the hardships they faced. In the midst of this chaos, key figures emerged who would shape the course of the war. Men like Nathaniel Greene, Henry Knox, and Francis Marion, who had risen through the ranks due to their bravery and strategic thinking, now played crucial roles in the Continental Army's leadership. Their stories, marked by hardship, perseverance, and ultimate triumph would become an integral part of American folklore. The French alliance, too, continued to play a vital role in the war, as men like Lafayette and Rochambeau worked closely with Washington to coordinate their efforts and plan their strategy. As the war drew to a close, the consequences of British actions became increasingly clear. The Southern Campaign, which had been intended to split the colonies and crush the rebellion, ultimately backfired as it galvanized opposition to British rule and created a sense of unity among the American people. The economic costs of the war, too, would be felt for generations to come as Britain struggled to pay off its debts and rebuild its economy. In 1778, British forces under General Augustine Prevost captured Savannah, Georgia, and began to push into the southern backcountry, where they encountered fierce resistance from patriot militias and guerrilla fighters. The humid, swampy terrain of the South seemed to swallow up the British troops, making every step a struggle against the unforgiving environment. The Patriots, on the other hand, knew this land like the back of their hand, using their intimate knowledge of the forests, swamps, and rivers to launch surprise attacks on British patrols and supply lines. The nature of the war in the South was vastly different from the conventional battles fought in the North, with its emphasis on hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, and sabotage. Guerrilla warfare and frontier conflicts became the hallmark of the Southern Campaign, as patriots like Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens waged a relentless campaign of harassment and disruption against British forces. These partisan leaders, often operating in small, mobile units, exploited their knowledge of the terrain and the support of local civilians to launch surprise attacks on British patrols and supply lines. The British, meanwhile, struggled to adapt to this unconventional style of warfare, which seemed to blur the lines between soldier and civilian and made it difficult for them to distinguish friend from foe. As the war dragged on, the psychological toll on both sides began to mount. British soldiers, exhausted and demoralized by the constant harassment, began to doubt their mission and question the wisdom of their commanders. The Patriots, on the other hand, were fueled by a growing sense of purpose and determination as they saw the British struggle to cope with the unconventional tactics. One Patriot leader, Francis Marion, became known as the Swamp Fox for his cunning and elusive tactics, which earned him a legendary status among his comrades and struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. One of the most significant battles fought during this period was the Battle of Camden, which took place in August 1780. British forces under General Charles Cornwallis defeated a Patriot army led by General Horatio Gates, inflicting heavy casualties and forcing the Americans to retreat. However, the British victory came at a high cost, as they suffered significant losses themselves, and the battle marked a turning point in the Southern Campaign. The Patriots, despite their defeat, had demonstrated their ability to withstand British attacks and continue fighting, and the battle galvanized support for the war effort among Southerners. The aftermath of Camden saw a surge in recruitment for the Patriot cause, as men from all over the South flocked to join the fight against the British. The battle also marked a shift in the balance of power between Loyalists and Patriots, as more and more colonists began to question their loyalty to the Crown. The British, meanwhile, struggled to maintain control over the territory they had gained, as partisan attacks and sabotage continued to disrupt their supply lines and communication networks. The following month, Patriot forces under General Daniel Morgan won a decisive victory at the Battle of Kings Mountain, where they defeated a large force of Loyalist militiamen. This battle was significant, not only because of its outcome, but also because it marked a shift in the balance of power in the South, as Patriots began to gain the upper hand against their Loyalist opponents. The British, meanwhile, continued to struggle with the challenges of guerrilla warfare, and their efforts to pacify the southern colonies were repeatedly thwarted by partisan attacks and sabotage. In January 1781, General Morgan won another significant victory at the Battle of Cowpens, where he defeated a British force led by Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton. This battle was notable for its innovative tactics, as Morgan's forces employed a clever combination of infantry and cavalry to outmaneuver and defeat the British. The Yorktown Campaign, which began in the summer of 1781, was the culmination of a long and complex series of maneuvers by American and French forces. Washington's army, supported by a large French force under General Jean-Baptiste Donatien de Vimeur, Comte de Rochambeau, marched south from New York to confront Cornwallis's army in Virginia. Meanwhile, a French fleet under Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse sailed up the Chesapeake Bay, blocking Cornwallis's escape route and trapping him against the sea. As the British army became increasingly hemmed in, Cornwallis grew desperate, ordering his men to build a series of fortifications and redoubts in a last-ditch attempt to hold off the Allied forces. But it was too late, as Washington's army closed in for the kill, supported by the French artillery and infantry. The final battle was intense and brutal, with both sides suffering heavy casualties, but in the end, it was the British who were forced to surrender. The British government, now led by Prime Minister Charles Watson Wentworth, 2nd Marquess of Rockingham, was eager to bring an end to the costly and unpopular war. The British people were growing increasingly tired of the conflict, which had drained their resources and claimed the lives of many young soldiers. American diplomats, including Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, met with their British counterparts in Paris to hammer out the terms of the Treaty of Paris, which would formally end the war and recognize American independence. The negotiations were grueling, with both sides engaging in a delicate dance of diplomacy, but ultimately, the Americans emerged victorious. The treaty, signed on September 3, 1783, was a significant achievement for the Americans, as it not only recognized their independence but also established the boundaries of the new nation. The treaty marked a major milestone in American history, as it formally ended British rule and paved the way for the United States to take its place among the nations of the world. However, the period following the treaty, known as the Critical Period under the Articles of Confederation, would prove to be a challenging time for the young nation. The Articles, which had been adopted in 1781, provided a weak central government with limited powers, leaving most authority to the individual states. This led to difficulties in coordinating national policy, resolving disputes between states, and addressing economic problems. As the weaknesses of the Articles became increasingly apparent, calls for reform grew louder. In 1787, a constitutional convention was convened in Philadelphia, bringing together some of the most prominent figures of the Revolution, including George Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. The convention's task was to draft a new constitution that would provide a stronger central government, while still protecting individual liberties and state sovereignty. After months of intense debate and negotiation, the Constitution was finalized and sent to the states for ratification. The process was far from smooth, with many critics arguing that the new document gave too much power to the federal government, but ultimately, it was ratified in 1788. The new government established by the Constitution would go on to face significant challenges, but it would also provide a foundation for the United States to grow and prosper in the decades that followed. The American Revolution's impact on global democratic movements cannot be overstated. The ideas of liberty, equality, and democracy that had inspired the Revolution would go on to inspire similar movements around the world, from the French Revolution to the Latin American Wars of Independence. The Revolution's emphasis on individual rights, representative government, and the rule of law would shape the course of modern history, influencing political developments in Europe, Asia, and beyond. One notable example of the Revolution's influence can be seen in the French Revolution, which began just a few years after the American Revolution ended. The French people, inspired by the American example, rose up against their own monarch, King Louis XVI, and established a new government based on the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Similarly, in Latin America, leaders such as Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín drew inspiration from the American Revolution as they fought for independence from Spanish and Portuguese rule. The Revolution's themes of liberty, self-governance, and the pursuit of happiness continue to resonate with people around the world today. The Revolution also had a profound impact on the individuals who lived through it. For example, Benjamin Franklin, who played a key role in securing French support for the American cause, was transformed by his experiences during the Revolution. He emerged as a leading figure in American politics and a champion of democracy, using his wit and wisdom to help shape the new nation. Similarly, George Washington, who led the Continental Army to victory, became a national hero and the first president of the United States, setting a high standard for integrity and leadership that would be emulated by future generations. The revolution's legacy can be seen in the many democratic movements that have followed in its wake, from the civil rights movement in the United States to the Arab Spring protests in the Middle East. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, remember that to understand the present, we must first understand the past.